Welcome, everyone. I'm welcome to this virtual program from the American Antiquarian Society entitled Isaiah Thomas's Apprenticeship, The Labor and Value of Children's Literature by Karen Sánchez-Eppler. I am Jim Moran, Vice President for Programs and Outreach at the American Antiquarian Society, and I'm joined by my colleague Kayla Hopper, the Society's Director of Outreach, who will be assisting in this seminar. Today, I will say a few words of introduction, then I will turn off my video and share. I will turn off my video and then turn the meeting over to Karen, who will present her formal remarks, and after those we will conduct some questions using the Q&A function of this webinar. We're reserving the chat function of the webinar for any questions you have of a technical nature, and later in the program we'll be sharing some other information with you through the chat as well. But if you have questions, we encourage you to use the Q&A, and you can move questions up using that raise up function as well. We are also recording this presentation for placement on the web so that you can view it at a later date. We intend to get to all of your questions during this webinar, but if we can't, we will answer any stray ones in emails after the program is over. The American Antiquarian Society is a learned society and a national research center that has been collecting and sharing America's stories for over 200 years. We offer a wide variety of both virtual and in-person programs that explore the history and culture of our nation from the time of first European settlement through the year 1876. Our library, located in Worcester, Massachusetts, holds approximately 4 million items, including the largest number of American imprints published before 1820 in the world. The Society was founded in 1812 by Isaiah Thomas, and as you will hear more soon, Thomas's mother was impoverished when Thomas's father abandoned the family, and Thomas was placed into an apprenticeship at the tender age of 6. He had a meager formal education. In fact, the printing house was really his essential schoolroom. He learned to read and write by setting type and studying an ink-stained Bible and a tattered dictionary. But despite this, he became one of the greatest printers of his generation. He was a rabble-rousing printer advocating for rebellion and then independence from Great Britain during the American Revolution. And after the war, he became the foremost printer and publisher of the new republic, and in so doing, became one of the wealthiest citizens of the nascent American nation. His passion for anything printed led him to collect even the most trivial of ephemeral items, along with important historical and literary texts. We've continued Thomas' collecting policy throughout the history of the American Antiquarian Society. It has allowed the AS collections to be the rich resources for people studying both the great and well-known voices, as well as the unknown and neglected ones from the American past. Because of Isaiah Thomas's vision, the AS collection now houses the words of both servants and presidents, slaves and masters, the impoverished as well as the privileged. Like Thomas, we hold that anything and everything printed in the past is worth preserving and sharing with the American people. Today, our speaker is Karen Sánchez-Eppler. She is the L. Stanton Williams 1941 Professor of American Studies and English at Amherst College. For this past academic year, she has also been the Andrew Mellon American Antiquarian Society Distinguished Scholar in Residence. As such, she is our senior fellow in residence, and has mentored our other long and short-term fellows, providing guidance on their research and helping to shape their intellectual projects, and providing career counseling as needed and desired. As you can imagine, this has been particularly challenging in this time of an international pandemic, but Dr. Sánchez-Eppler has done a wonderful job, and we are all richer for her presence among us. Dr. Sánchez-Eppler is a scholar who explores how literature interacts with societal structures and informs social change. She has also been a leader in the burgeoning field of child studies, exploring in her more recent work how children are historical actors and how their perspectives and worldviews can inform and deepen our understanding of the American past. She is the author of Touching Liberty, Abolition, Feminism, and the Politics of the Body, and Independent States, the Child's Part in 19th Century American Culture. In addition to AAS, her scholarship has been supported by grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council for Learned Societies, the Newberry Library, the Winterthur Library, the Stanford Humanities Center, and the Fulbright Foundation. She is one of the founding co-editors of the Journal of History of Childhood and Youth and past president of C19, the Society of 19th Century Americanists. And now I will turn the program over to you, Karen.
Thank you so much, Jim, for that kind introduction. I'm so grateful to the American Antiquarian Society for the invitation to offer this public program and for so much more. The Society Library contains wonderful collections made infinitely more valuable because they've been cataloged and curated with such knowledge and care. I can't name everyone now, but my most heartfelt thanks to all the marvelous Antiquarian Society staff. You're just the best. With a few marked exceptions, the images I'll be showing today all come from materials held at AAS. The past few pandemic months and past weeks of protest have provided a clear accounting of the unequal ways the nation values lives, labor, and money, the destructive effects of racial, class, and age bias, and the importance of each discrete decision about what we care to preserve. My talk today is historical and archival, tracing one mid-18th century to early 19th century instance in the study of book history, the history of childhood, and children's literature. But preparing to talk to you now, I've also tried to think about my research in terms of these questions of what matters. We can never say it too often. The American Antiquarian Society stands on Nipmuc land, and Black lives matter. I arrived at the Society last summer for a year of research on a project in the archives of childhood, playing with the past, that thinks about how and why childhood materials are preserved and what those practices of preservation can tell us both about attitudes towards childhood and about attitudes towards the past. I arrived thinking of the institution itself and its history as far less interesting for me than its specific holdings of children's books and manuscripts. Still, it behooved me to learn about the origins of the Antiquarian Society. And once you pay attention to childhood, once attuned to children as social actors and childhood as a social construction, as Allison James describes the core paradigm for childhood studies, all sorts of things become visible. And not surprisingly, Isaiah Thomas's own career, including the founding of the American Antiquarian Society, provide a very illuminating instance of how childhood is valued. And now, a slide should move forward, but it's not. There it is. So I was going to now, what I already knew of Isaiah Thomas was an oft-told, quintessentially American story, a patriotic tale of self-making. And basically, it's the story that Jim so wonderfully summarized for us just a minute ago. So I'm not going to rehearse it again. You can see the main dates here. And then they end with the founding of Antiquarian Hall in 1812, where Thomas amassed a collection of American print material for his research on the history of printing. Maybe actually Jim didn't say anything about that, so let me take a little moment back to just say that coming out of this work, Thomas knew that he had lived through historical times and that print had played a strong role in that history, not just recording, but making the American Revolution. He understood print's technological and business models to have evolved in tandem with the nation, and he desired to retire from the press to write a history of printing in America, relying on research, personal memory, and the recollections of colleagues to record many circumstances and events which must soon have been buried in oblivion. And that's a quote from his preface to the History of Printing. Amassing a collection of American print materials for this research in 1812, he founded a society, to the words of the Antiquarian Society's bicentennial historian, Thomas Gura, collect all things that pertain to American history, no matter how slight or insignificant they might seem at the moment of their acquisition. This is a narrative of national formation and institutional formation. It's a great book history story. But how is it about childhood and children's literature? One of the things I've learned studying childhood is that it's relevant to most social, historical, political, and cultural issues. That we rarely think of it as relevant is a question of values. One of my goals in this research is to question the presumption that slight and insignificant, it does not matter if the history of childhood is left to oblivion. It is also my hope that paying attention to childhood can illuminate other sites of national inattention and inequity, as well as the roles that both childhood experience and children's literature may play in fostering other inequalities. This is the document that bound Isaiah Thomas as an apprentice to Zachariah Fowle and his wife. Such pauper apprenticeships coexisted in colonial Massachusetts besides many other forms of unfree labor, including the enslavement initially of Native Americans and then of African Americans, part of a continuum of coercive labor arrangements with widely disparate constraints and outcomes. As you can see, this indenture was written on a pre-printed form with blank spaces left for handwritten conditions and specifications. I'm using yellow italics to transcribe the manuscript portions of this form. Pre-printed forms testify to the prevalence of pauper apprenticeship. Boston magistrates began using pre-printed forms as early as 1704, one bit of print shop business in the colony. As they shift from printed to manuscript portions, such forms materialize the tension between societal expectations and individual needs, and the capacity for agency and negotiation. Child labor was a mainstay of the Massachusetts economy. Children from more economically stable households worked for their own family or were bound out to households that could provide training in a specific skill. In New England during this period, most apprentices were bound in their early teens, but the overseers of the poor were charged with organizing care for children at risk of destitution, and so were interested in binding much younger children. Town taxes supported the destitute members of a community, so the overseers had a strong financial incentive to transfer to masters and to young people's own labor responsibility for children who might become burdens to the town. Isaiah had already been living with and working for Zachariah Fowle before this formal indenture was signed, so his mother may have had some hand in the specific arrangement, but she has no role in this document. Binding out expressed the state's sense of what constituted an appropriate household, and single mothers could rarely meet those standards. It is the named gentlemen, overseers of the poor, justices of the peace, who witness and set the terms of this contract binding Isaiah Thomas, a poor child belonging to said Boston, belonging expressing both town accountability and control, unto Zachariah Fowle of Boston aforesaid, printer, and to his wife and heirs, until the said apprentice, if living, will arrive to the age of 21 years. Wife and heirs have a standing in this document that the indentured child and his mother do not. The terms of Isaiah's apprenticeship pertained to service to his master, but the form is equally explicit about the more general maintenance of social order. The said apprentice, his master and mistress well and faithfully shall serve. And it details that and then goes on. At cards, dice, or any other unlawful game or games he shall not play. Fornication he shall not commit. Matrimony during the said term he shall not contract. Taverns, alehouses, or places of gaming he shall not haunt or frequent. In return, Fowle agreed to house, feed, and clothe the boy, and to teach or cause the said apprentice to be taught by the best way and means he can the art and mystery of a printer, also to read, write, and cipher. These literacy and numeracy requirements and the 2 suits of clothes promised to Thomas as freedom dues were the standard for Euro-American boys in Boston. Indentured African-American children and Euro-American girls were generally promised both less education and smaller freedom dues. In Ruth Herndon's survey of these indentures, she found that 1/3 of white Boston boys bound out by the overseers of the poor received some additional payment in cash, land, or tools of their trade upon completion of their indenture. Thomas was promised no such extra benefits. Of course, any freedom dues would have been lost since he ran away before the end of his apprenticeship, something I'm realizing that was in my summary, but not in Jim's. Thomas did return to work for Fowle for a short period in 1767, and at 21, he negotiated a partnership with his old master, clearly finding that arrangement his best route to becoming a master printer himself. The newspaper he founded with Fowle is called the Massachusetts Spy. Once a master, Thomas often printed notices for the recapture of runaway apprentices. 2 of those ads here. The print shop where Isaiah Thomas apprenticed mostly produced wares hawked by peddlers, small chapbooks or bawdy and satirical broadside ballads like this one, which notes it should be sung to the beggar's opera tune, Polly is a sad slut. Such broadsides are the epitome of print ephemera, a cheap entertainment to be enjoyed and thrown away. This particular ballad, The Lawyer's Pedigree, has something of a house that Jack built structure. It begins, a beggar had a beetle had a yeoman had apprentice had a freeman, the freeman had a master, the master had a lease, the lease made him a gentleman and justice of the peace. Here the passage from beggar and apprentice to the gentleman and justice of the peace, that is to the status of the men who witnessed apprenticed indentures, rests upon question of property. Who holds the lease? The ballad also recounts bawdier modes of social and sexual mobility. The nun she was with child, and so her credit sunk. The father was a friar, the issue was a monk. Or, Lord Abbot had a maid and catched her in the dark, and something did to her, and so he had a clerk. It concludes, and so it came to pass, as beggar's brat, a scolding knave, a crafty lawyer was. This system cheerfully imagines the promotion of the beggar, the prentice, and the bastard, but it is also important to recognize that the lecherous logic of the ballad's pedigrees never entails advancement for women. There are only 2 known extant copies of this broadside, and both are annotated by Isaiah Thomas. This is the writing just visible here through the verso of the sheet. The Lawyer's Pedigree, a ballad being printed from the types which Isaiah Thomas first set for the press, which was in the spring of 1755, being then but 6 years of age. And also here, printed from pica type, first set by Isaiah Thomas at 6 years of age. On both copies, Thomas also inserts the 1755 date at the foot of the broadside page, besides the place of publication, completing the sheet's bibliographic data. Moreover, on one copy, he adds a note about possible authorship, said to be written by Dean Swift. Thomas's annotations mix bibliographic and biographical concerns. Bibliographically, they strive to grant the undated, anonymous ballad a clear, and if written by Jonathan Swift, a quite illustrious pedigree. At the same time, the date serves to document how young Isaiah was when setting this type. We don't know precisely how, why, or when the adult Thomas re-encountered and annotated these texts he had set as a child, but it's clear that he immediately recognized this broadside and wanted to preserve it, both for itself, as a bit of popular culture, and as material evidence of his own childhood labor. As Herndon demonstrates, pauper apprenticeship was not a secure route to independent adulthood, even for Euro-American boys. Binding out was not intended to give poor children opportunities above their station. It was not a progressive system, but one designed to maintain the status quo. It's only because of the exceptional shape of Isaiah Thomas's career, his extraordinary, uncharacteristic rise, coupled with his interest in preservation, that his juvenile labors and his agency as a juvenile actor remain legible. Indeed, he would insert references to his apprenticeship experiences, learning, and labor throughout his history of printing in America, not just in the sections devoted to Fowl's shop or to his own career. The preservation of the history of printing intertwines for Thomas with the picaresque Bildungsroman of apprenticeship, literalizing Robert Darnton's notion of the biography or life cycle of books. In the history of printing in America, Thomas mentions this first attempt with the composing stick. In an autobiographical fragment he never printed, he describes these labors with greater first-person detail. His narration revises the power dynamics of the indenture, where, as Herndon puts it, magistrates and masters cooperatively worked out the terms under which the least powerful members of the community were put to work and prepared for adulthood. In Thomas's telling, the master petitions and the overseers of the poor assist. My mother then was left with 5 children to bring up, without any means of her own for their support. In this extremity, she did the best in her power. Myself, the youngest, was at the tender age of 6 years, at her request, brought home, and at the earnest request of Mr. Zachariah Fowle, a printer and seller of ballads and peddler's small books, placed in his care. After I had lived with him a short time, he persuaded my mother to let me be bound to him till I was 21 years of age, which was accomplished by the aid of the overseers of the poor, as I had no guardian. After I was bound and he had absolute power over me, he put me to all the servile employments in his family that I could perform. And when business of that kind was wanting, he placed me at the type cases. In order that I might reach the boxes of both capitals and lower case, he had a bench made of sufficient height and of the length of a double frame, that I might traverse when necessary from Roman to italic and from italic to Roman. I soon learned the type boxes. The first essay I made was on a ballad called The Lawyer's Pedigree. I set the type, which was double pica, for this ballad in 2 days, though I then only knew the letters, but had never been taught to put them together and spell. His office was the only school I ever had. I soon learned by practice to set types and to read tolerably, and obtained some knowledge of punctuation. This account does not, of course, provide testimony of Thomas's own childhood perspective. Thomas penned this document from the retrospect of an accomplished adult printer, and it forages a satisfyingly heroic narrative of his becoming. Still, there is no reason to question the accuracy of his account of the bench that enabled his juvenile press work, his lack of formal schooling, or his childhood capacity to accurately set type before he could read. I am struck by the care Thomas takes here to explain and sympathize with his mother's situation, and of course, by the detailed description of his press work. The double sense this narration gives of exploitation and skilled enfranchising accomplishment. The many terms of trade in this brief account, like the pica of his inscription on the broadside itself, assert expertise. In another autobiographical fragment, Thomas records of his apprenticeship that he was twice whipped when a child by my master and made to confess crimes I never committed. Throughout his writings, Thomas expresses much contempt for Fowle's lack of skill and ambition, but there is no evidence that he was a particularly harsh or demanding master. Attention to his apprentices' need as well as to profit is evident in Fowell's building of that bench. Thomas complained frequently that despite the terms of his indenture, he received no formal schooling. Primers and educational texts were, however, among the least ephemeral printed matter produced in Fowell's shop. The section of the history of printing devoted to Benjamin Meekum, who had served his own apprenticeship in Philadelphia with his uncle Benjamin Franklin, describes Meekum and Fowell's collaboration in printing a large edition of the New England Primer. Thomas notes that he himself was then a lad in my 8th year. The impression consisted of 10,000 copies. The form was small 16s on foolscap paper. The first form of the primer being set up, while it was worked at the press, I was put to case to set the types for the second. And having completed this and set up the whole cast of types employed in the work, and the first form being still at press, I was employed as a fly, that is, to take off the sheets from the tympan as they were printed and pile them in a heap. This expedited the work. In a third autobiographical fragment, this one written in the third person, Thomas claims that by the time he was 10 years old, quote, he had the whole management of Fowell's printing office. That is, he did the work in his own way and corrected the press as well as he could. A note inside the cover of Tom Thumb's playbook may provide evidence of such autonomy. It records that the book was printed by I. Thomas as apprentice in 1764 for A. Barclay, that is, when Thomas was around 15. Tom Thumb's playbook features a cheerful secular alphabet rhyme set in a quite complex layout that would require significant printerly skill. Surely, given the labor conditions of Thomas's own literacy acquisition, there must have been some sting or yearning in the project of creating a new and pleasant method to lure the little ones in the first principles of learning. What would it mean for this boy who at 6 had stood on a bench to reach the type boxes and had served at 8 as a fly for a more sober primer to print a book that might teach children their letters as soon as they can speak? Thomas was never apprenticed to A. Barclay, so this inscription may point to his ability to negotiate side jobs for himself. In what may be a printerly act of playful insurrection, the cut Thomas chose to put on the back cover of this book is an image of boys playing dice or marbles, just the sort of gaming his indenture forbid. There was much child labor in print shops, and we know even more in rag picking and paper making. One of my goals with this research is to prod scholars of children's literature to pay attention to this aspect of book history and childhood history. The labor of bookmaking is one rarely noted way that children may be present in the archive of children's literature. In addition to setting type, Thomas notes that he also learned to decorate the ballads and peddlers' pamphlets issued from Fowell's press. Fowell's edition of the New Book of Knowledge features Thomas's juvenile engravings, information he inscribed in this latter 1767 imprint, with the disclaimer, bad as the cuts are executed. The frontispiece of the New Book of Knowledge is far more accomplished, and it seems likely that this plate was cut by someone else, or cut by Thomas later for the 1767 edition. The catalog of Thomas's personal library lists both his son Isaiah Thomas Jr.'s 1796 Worcester edition and the one done in his apprenticeship, making that timing explicit with a parenthesis. In the 1796 Worcester edition, it reprints that Fowell frontispiece, but replaces the interior illustrations with better plates cut by another hand. Marginal annotations, parenthetical mentions, and the glimpses of his apprenticeship scattered through Thomas's accounts of the work of adult printers all locate child labor nowhere and everywhere in the history of print. Other forms of unfree labor are similarly invisible and ubiquitous. Describing the print shop of Thomas Fleet, printer since 1735 of the Boston Evening Post, Thomas writes, He owned several Negroes, one of which worked at the printing business, both at the press and at setting types. He was an ingenious man and cut on wood blocks all the pictures which decorated the ballads and small books of his master. Fleet had also two Negro boys born in his house, sons, I believe, to the man just mentioned, whom he brought up to work at press and case, one named Pompey and the other Caesar. They were young when their master died, but they remained in the family and continued to labor regularly in the printing house with the sons of Mr. Fleet, who succeeded their father until the Constitution of Massachusetts, adopted in 1780, made them freemen. In a third-person autobiographical fragment, Thomas boasts of his own work cutting plates, depicting his labors in explicit rivalry with that of Fleet's enslaved craftsmen. His juvenile cuts, quote, answered the purpose, Thomas wrote, and were nearly a match for those executed by a Negro of old Thomas Fleet. Sinclair Hamilton hypothesizes that Fleet and Fowle's editions of The Prodigal Daughter may attest to this competition between enslaved man and apprenticed boy, with IT imitating and reversing the illustrations cut by PF. Those initials could stand for Pompey Fleet, possibly the younger enslaved printer, but more likely the older ingenious man who might well, like many fathers, have named his son after himself. It seems indicative of the hierarchies of unfree labor in the Boston print trade that in calling his work nearly a match for that produced in Fleet's shop, Thomas both acknowledges his competitive apprentice relationship to the work of an enslaved artist and downplays his imitative tutelary debts. Historians of African-American print culture have recognized Fleet's shop as a clear instance of the role the institution of slavery played in the development of American printing. Not only did Fleet employ enslaved labor in his shop, he also, like many early printers, combined his printing business with a host of other commercial efforts. In 1731, Fleet acquired a large house on Cornhill, where he located his press and bookshop and set up an auction house in a spacious front room where he sold a wide array of merchandise, including both books and human beings. This afternoon will be sold by Thomas Fleet at the Heart and Crown in Cornhill by way of auction or vendue, the best part of the books which should have been sold last night, together with two likely young Negro women in good health and most sorts of household goods, viz. Feather beds, looking glasses, tables, desks, as well as saws and guns and dresses just arrived from London and set in the peak of the mode with gloves, linen cloth, etc. I don't know what happened to the printers enslaved to Fleet's shop after they became freemen. Thomas, in contrast, not only preserved material evidence and fragmented narratives of his childhood labors, he also retained the press on which he first set type as an apprentice. In this way, his commitment to preserving the nation's early print history enfolds the preservation of his own childhood practice as a printer's apprentice. Thomas acquired this press in 1770 when he brought out his old master, Zachariah Fowle, thus purchasing the instrument to which he had been indentured. He continued to use the press in his print shop at least into the 1790s. This press, Old Number 1, as Thomas called it, is now displayed above the reading room in Antiquarian Hall. When the American Antiquarian Society restored the press in the 1980s, a scrap of printed material was found pasted to it, this monkey. The illustration is a page from Food for the Mind, a book of riddles first printed in London by John Newbery in 1778. While the text is the same, Thomas's 1794 edition of this riddle sports a far better and obviously New World monkey. Someone who worked this press at the very end of the 18th century apparently appreciated this children's book, this riddling monkey, enough to use it to decorate this workplace. Here's the whole riddle. If old stories say true, I could once talk like you, but for fear of becoming a slave, I was instantly mute and grew cunning to boot, determined my freedom to save. Now to the fop and the fool and the rude boy at school, all endeavor to practice my art, but their efforts are vain, they pretenders remain, and must till the world they depart. to observe how I grin with snub nose, lips, and chin, with the laughter excite of a lord, and for mimicry too I my betters outdo, and more innocent pleasure afford. Questions of speech and silence, enslavement and independence, mimicry and status ricochet through this riddling verse in a way that is suffused with racial, class, and colonial hierarchies. A picture of a monkey printed in a cheap book for children, its text copied from an English original in the years after the American Revolution, was pasted as an unruly, joking decoration on the printing press where 6-year-old Isaiah Thomas learned to set type as an apprentice, and that he later owned as a master. The replicated capacities of both print and apprenticeship rely on copying. Imitation can be enfranchising, as it surely was for Isaiah Thomas. But as this poem demonstrates, its potential for enfranchisement met rigid, racialized limits. These questions of value and preservation also pertain, of course, to the collections of the American Antiquarian Society. When in 1812, Isaiah Thomas donated his personal library to form the basis of this new institution, he accompanied it with a meticulous manuscript catalog of 2,650 titles. As in the entry for the New Book of Knowledge, references to Thomas's apprenticeship are scattered through this volume, much as they are in the history of printing. As you can see from the table of contents, about half the materials donated were items Thomas collected, and the second half of the catalog lists books printed by him or his son. The alphabetical list of Thomas titles includes many children's books, here Robinson Crusoe, in a fine copy with gilt binding that sells for $1. But most of the children's titles are school books. Indeed, the very last book printed by the Worcester Press under Isaiah Thomas Sr.'s imprint was an 1802 edition of the New England Primer, the same text he had set and served as fly when he was 8 years old. The New England Primer is surely the most important early American children's book, but most of Thomas's juveniles are English reprints. Look at this June 1785 advertisement for children's books sent from London. It's full of titles Thomas would later publish himself. Just a few months later, in October 1785, he wrote an editorial for the Massachusetts Spy arguing for American production. People whose imports exceed their exports cannot grow rich, he wrote. The Worcester magazine of the following July still advertises on its first page a fresh supply of books just received from London, including a great variety of children's books. But the bottom of an inside page of the same issue includes an advertisement directed to booksellers, alerting them that a large assortment of all the various sizes of children's books known by the name of Newbery's Little Books for Children are now being republished by I. Thomas in Worcester, Massachusetts. They are done exactly in the English method, and it is supposed the paper, printing, cuts, and binding are every way equal to those imported from England. As the subscriber has been at great expense to carry on this particular branch of printing extensively, he hopes to meet with encouragement from the booksellers in the United States. The section of the catalog devoted to Isaiah Thomas imprints ends with a short list of his books for children, organized somewhat differently than the main catalog by price and size rather than alphabetically. As you can see, the titles listed here are by and large the same titles he had been importing from London. They are indeed Newbery reprints. Thomas himself frequently reissued these little books, producing multiple editions. They were what book historians call steady sellers. These books were small in size, cheap, 4 cents, 8 cents, 10 cents, 17 cents, and the most expensive at 20 cents, and plentiful. Many of his advertisements list these titles individually or by the dozen. You can see a 4th edition of Tom Thumb's playbook listed here, also Cock Robin, a small Robinson Crusoe, and riddle and game books such as Food for the Mind, That Monkey. Thomas notes at the bottom of his list of size number 1 4-cent books, several others of this size not recollected. In a generally highly detailed catalog, these children's titles appear to be more generic, and in many ways, Thomas treats these books as essentially interchangeable. Yet Thomas's children and school books clearly mattered to his business. Indeed, they seem to have generated a quarter to a third of his press profits in these years. Clarence Brigham, Antiquarian Society librarian and director for 50 years from 1908 to 1959, writes, "There's every reason why the American Antiquarian Society should emphasize the collecting of children's books. Isaiah Thomas, the founder of the society, was the most noted publisher of children's books of his day and issued more of these little volumes than any other American publisher of the 18th century. Yet strangely, he did not deem them worthy of preservation in the comprehensive library which he bequeathed to the society." Why not? Are children's books good enough to sell, but not good enough to archive? Too slight and insignificant? Or do these enduringly popular children's titles continuously fly off the shelf, selling too well to donate? I would suggest that both these reasons pertain, that these early American children's books are durable and ephemeral at once, both too remarkable culturally and too valuable commercially to be archived. Even the juvenile texts Thomas listed in his main catalog were rarely included in Thomas's founding donation to the society. This splendid hieroglyphic Bible is listed in his catalog right above Thomas's own History of Printing in America itself, The Pleasures of the Alphabet's Random Juxtapositions. But the copy the Antiquarian Society holds now was only acquired in 1929, a gift from Charles Lemuel Nichols. An AAS council member and society president during Brigham's tenure, Nichols' biography of Thomas's Worcester imprints was the first accounting of his juvenile publications. It confirms that the bulk were initially printed in 1787, followed by periodic reprintings and occasional editions, and that despite Thomas's significant investment in their initial and continued production, he did not ensure that these little books were preserved as part of the American Antiquarian Society's print record. As Brigham explains, when the present director came to the library in 1908, he did not find a single Thomas juvenile except for 11 volumes, which Thomas had had beautifully bound in leather with elaborate tooling and labeled on the spine, Youth's Library. Every other volume in our collection of over 90 editions of Thomas juveniles has been acquired since 1908. Nichols is himself responsible for donating to the society 38 Thomas juveniles. As you can see, Brigham was not quite right even about the Youth's Library. Not all of its 11 volumes were retained. Volume 4 is still missing, and Volume 8, Vice in its proper shape, was missing as well. The copy in the box now was donated by Nichols in the same splendid binding, but lacking Thomas's bookplate, present in all the copies donated to AAS by Thomas himself. As for the content of this gorgeously bound Youth's Library, the pages themselves are the inexpensive pamphlets Thomas printed in the 1780s and 90s. Although not the cheapest, the library consists of his size 4 17-cent books. The decision to put such ornate bindings on these cheap juvenile pamphlets is itself a mark of how Thomas values juvenilia. In the Youth's Library, the pamphlets appear as precious jewels, ephemera enshrined. Here, the trivial and the treasured are the same thing. In the many annotations and scattered mentions I've discussed, Isaiah Thomas revises and affirms his experience of being bound out by the overseers of the poor. Thomas's recollections and collections revalue pauper apprenticeship in ways that mirror what this gorgeously bound Youth's Library does to revalue children's literature. Let's call it the bindings of Isaiah. And one closing bond. Thomas was well aware that these issues of self-appraisal also bespeak social values. All the wills Thomas made when he was himself a printer include bequests, initially to his own apprentices and later for the advancement of printer apprentices as a class. After the founding of the Antiquarian Society, and as the practices of indenture and craft apprenticeship themselves declined in New England, Thomas shifted his largest charitable bequests to the society. Even his final will, however, still retained a bequest to provide children of poor parents with books. Thank you very much. There you go.
Thank you very much, Karen, for that wonderful talk. We don't have any formal Q&A right now, but I do have a comment that was made from one of our participants that I think is really interesting. J.L. Bell, who many will know is a bloggist and an expert on childhood in colonial America, has mentioned that the fleet, Pompey and Prince and Caesar, were actually, he sees that one of the fleet printers left with the British in 1776, while the other remained in Boston, and Pompey fleet left Boston in 1776, New York in 1783, and Nova Scotia in 1792, settling in Sierra Leone. Caesar appears in the records of Prince Hall's early Freemason lodge in Boston, according to Mr. Bell. So they
Awesome.
one appeared and one left the community.
That's I will say that I decided to put fleet stuff into this talk in the last few weeks, and in a world in which I only have whatever books I happen to have in my house. So I was hoping that someone would know the answer to that, and really delighted that this is the thing I can follow up and include. So thank you so much.
We have another question about Thomas's moving to Worcester on the eve of the American Revolution. And the question is, could you speak more about that? And was he assisted by Timothy Bigelow?
Yes. So I ended up, as you could probably tell in my fumbling, skipping my sort of summary, because it felt like we just got a great summary from Jim. But there was as initially Thomas imagined the spy as being an objective and even-handed paper, but he became increasingly revolutionary in his content and experienced pressures and felt under threat both for his own imprisonment and for the confiscation of his press. And so the decision was to move it out of Boston. And yes, he was in that endeavor himself, assisted by his apprentices. And I guess another thing I cut when I cut my Thomas career summary is that when he goes on to set up many other print shops and bookstores and sort of expands his print empire and really becomes a kind of capitalist, first capitalist printer in America, as Shipton describes it. He relies heavily on his apprentices to do that. Almost all of his partners are people who had been his apprentices. So there's another layer or piece of this that's about those relations. Though in almost all of those cases, he takes them on in a much more usual, already teenager, skilled labor assistant way, rather than taking on 6-year-olds.
And I think the question was also specifically about Colonel Timothy Bigelow, the
yes.
and what role he played in Thomas's moving to Worcester.
I should be able to do that, but I'm blanking. So I will answer that one in a typing out.
Well,
later,
I can also
make it. You can answer it and get it right.
I don't
want to get it wrong.
Bigelow did assist Thomas in the physical movement of his press. He set up the type in Bigelow's home. Bigelow was only a blacksmith in Worcester, but he married up, as one might say, to a wealthier woman. And Bigelow did own a fairly substantial house. And so Thomas was able to initially set his press up in Bigelow's house and published the first edition of the Massachusetts Spy, the May 3rd, 1775.
From his basement, right.
From that basement location, right. We have another question about the children's literature market in the book trades. Do you have a sense of how big children's literature was in the book market in the late 18th century? And how did that compare with it in the late antebellum period?
So it grows and it changes significantly. But you can see in Thomas's records, in terms of like the numbers of pages of imprints and things, John Garcia, who's was also a fellow with here recently, working on other things, had some moment where he was going through the stock books and counting them up and said he saw 400,000 pages of juvenile imprint in 1 year. So there's most juvenile, so it depends a little bit what you're talking about, because juvenile imprints are, the books themselves are smaller, have fewer pages, are cheaper. But in terms of sort of quantities and titles, by the late 18th century, that's become a significant portion of the trade. And of course, school books, which are used repeatedly and by groups of children, were already in the 18th century and remain to this day one of the most secure places in the publishing industry. The notion of children's literature as a site of play more than didacticism is definitely something that Thomas is one of the early promoters of in the US in that decision to reprint Newbery books, which is of course one of the early sites of that in English language children's literature. And there's a significant next wave of move in that direction that happens, I guess I'd say after the 1820s, after 1826 or so, a shift in that direction in American children's literature, and that expands it in the late antebellum period.
We have another question. Were there possibilities for children apprentices to become journeymen?
Yes. That's not the model for Thomas. So a little bit of I guess I haven't done a full enough survey of this to have enormous confidence in my answer, but my sense is that people who were apprenticed to printers as more career building models of being apprenticed as young men from similar classed families into a family whose skills they wanted to acquire. So someone who was saying, a printer is what I want to be, and who had a family with some resources of its own were more likely to be able to have that step-by-step model of promotion.
Some scholars credit Thomas with promoting Christmas literature in New England, which started out as hostile to that holiday. How does that fit into the publications, into his publications for children?
I just did the bad thing of trying to read along with you, and I didn't see that question. So do it again. Sorry, Jim.
Yeah, it's okay. J.L. Bell actually is asking this question. Some scholars credit Thomas with promoting Christmas literature in New England.
Got it.
Which started out as hostile to that holiday. How does that fit into his publications for children?
The thing that I can see most clearly is actually more on the early hostility model, in that one of the things that he does when he's reprinting the Newberries is to do some Americanization. So replacing Tommy Tripp as an author with Charlie Columbus as a new Americanized author, or you saw it with the changing of what the monkey looks like. And one similar instance he does in A Nurse Truelove's Christmas box that he turns into a New Year's gift. So he retitles it against Christmas. He gets Christmas out of the title that was in the Newbery book. So I think at least when he begins that work, he's understanding that there is New England resistance to Christmas, and he wants to sell these books, and he doesn't want to mess it up with that. So he makes Christmas disappear from the title. I suspect that by the time you get to later, into the early 19th century, so that or the very end of the that was a 1787 decision, that retitling, and I think some of his later juveniles are willing to put Christmas forward, so that would then ultimately align with Dr. Bell's point.
Another viewer writes, I'm struck at the similarities to Benjamin Franklin and wondering how that should influence how we see Thomas's self-presentation. In Thomas's autobiography, he speaks of Fowle in much the same way that Franklin talks about Samuel Kramer. Mm-hmm. Both men also set up ways to help the poor in urban areas. This person is wondering, to what extent do you think Thomas might have been self-consciously modeling himself on Franklin?
I am sure that he is, and in this, in the same ways that that Franklin presents his autobiography in I guess printer language, printerly terms, terms of errata, for instance, that model of book history and personal biography as mirrors for each other, I think suffuse the kinds of patterns that that I was finding once I started noticing the ways in which he included details about his apprenticeship in what was supposed to be a history of printing, or in the catalog, that is, places that seem not to proclaim themselves as autobiographical sites. And and there's quite, I think, many moments in his correspondence, in his diary, and in the history of printing, where the ways in which he sees Franklin as a model are quite clear, and I think that it's absolutely true that that's the case about this as well. I agree.
I think we're now about out of time. We had other questions in the Q&A, and we will follow up with those offline. As I mentioned, this program it has been recorded. It will be placed upon our website for further viewing in the future. I want to thank Karen Sánchez-Eppler very much for an excellent talk, and to encourage all of you to join us again for virtual programs. We'll have more coming up in the summer, and if you'd like to join our mailing list, please go to our website, and there's a virtual program page there where you can sign up for further programs. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you at our next virtual program.
Thank you. Thank you all. And I'm having a fun time now looking at all the questions I didn't get to. So, all right, thanks.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.